Your last name follows you everywhere. It's on your birth certificate, your passport, your bank account, your tax return. You probably assume it's ancient, something passed down through generations, rooted deep in your family's past. But for most of human history, ordinary people didn't have last names. You were just John, just Maria, just Ahmed. One name was enough because everyone in your village already knew who you were. The reason you carry a surname today has almost nothing to do with identity or tradition. It has everything to do with the government's need to find you, count you, and take your money. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how something as personal as your family name was invented by bureaucrats, imposed by empires, and designed from the very beginning as a tool to make you visible to the state. A world of one name rewind far enough, and the world runs on single names. A farmer in medieval England is just William. A weaver in an Ottoman village is just Mehmet. A fisherman in pre-colonial Philippines is known by a name that describes where he lives. Beside the sea, near the river, on the hill. Nobody needs anything more. Your community is small. Everyone knows who you are by sight, by voice, by reputation. Adding a second name would be as unnecessary as labeling your own front door. When a second identifier did appear, it was loose and temporary. William might be called William the Baker because he baked bread, or William from the Hill because his house sat at the top of the village. His son, Thomas, would not inherit that label. Thomas might be called Thomas, William's son, and that phrase, in time, would compress into a word, Williamson. But Thomas's child could easily carry a different by name entirely. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was permanent. Names were descriptions, not categories. This wasn't primitive, it was efficient. In a world where your entire social and economic life happened within walking distance, one name worked. The baker knew you, the priest knew you, the local lord's tax collector knew you. Or more precisely, he knew how many households existed and roughly what they owed. Nobody needed a bureaucratic system to tell one person from another, because the community itself was the system. Everyone was visible by default. The state didn't need to make you legible because the village already had. The problem started when communities grew too large for face-to-face recognition, when people moved between towns, when property changed hands between strangers, and when rulers governed territories they'd never visited. That's when the single name stopped being enough, not for the person carrying it, but for the authority trying to govern them. The Chinese were the exception. Family names existed in China as far back as the 3rd millennium BCE, millennia before anyone in Europe carried a surname. By the Song dynasty, around 960 CE, the Baijiaxing, as in the 100 family surnames, had been compiled as a literary text that children memorized in school. But China is the exception that proves the rule. It was also one of the earliest civilizations to build a centralized bureaucratic state. China had surnames because China had a government educated enough to need them. The administrative apparatus came first, the names followed. The Romans had a more elaborate structure, 3 names for citizens, the famous tria nomina, praenomen, nomen, and cognomen. A full Roman citizen name encoded family lineage and clan identity. But even this system dissolved after the fall of the Western Empire. By the early Middle Ages, Europe had reverted to single names across most of its population. The technology of the multi-part name had been invented and then forgotten, because the political conditions that made it useful, a vast centralized empire that needed to track millions of citizens, had collapsed along with the roads and the aqueducts. That detail matters more than it seems. The surname isn't just a cultural artifact, it's an administrative technology. And like all technologies, it appears when someone needs it, disappears when they don't, and gets reimposed by force when someone powerful decides they can't function without it. The Conqueror's Ledger, the modern surname in the English-speaking world, traces back to a specific event, the Norman conquest of 1066. When William the Conqueror seized England, he didn't just take the throne, he took the land. And to manage the land, to know who owned what, who owed what, and who could be taxed for what, he needed records, detailed, comprehensive, village-by-village records of every piece of property in his new kingdom. The result was the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. It was the most ambitious census in European history up to that point, a complete inventory of land, livestock, tenants, and assets across virtually every settlement in England. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers called it Domesday the Gaze, was the day of judgment, because like God's final accounting, no one could escape it and no appeal was possible. Its commissioners traveled the entire country, interrogating local officials under oath about every acre and every animal. Embedded in its pages is a quiet revolution in naming. In the records from 1066, many English landowners are listed by single Anglo-Saxon names. By 1086, just 20 years later, surnames start appearing. The Norman ruling class had brought the practice with them from France, and the administrative demands of governing a conquered nation accelerated its spread. The Domesday Book wasn't created because William cared about English identity. It was created because he needed to extract wealth from English soil. And to extract wealth efficiently, you need to know exactly who owns what. A kingdom full of Williams and Johns and Edwards is ungovernable. A kingdom where William Baker owns 3 fields and William Hill owns 2. That's a kingdom you can tax. Over the next 3 centuries, surnames spread downward through English society. Initially, they were fluid. A man called Robert the Smith might have a son called Thomas, who was a carpenter, and Thomas would take a different byname. Surnames drifted. They changed with occupation, with location, with whim. A family's name in one generation had no guarantee of surviving into the next. But the state needs things to stay still. And gradually, through property registers, parish records, and court documents, surnames hardened. By the time Richard II imposed the poll tax in 1381, most English families had adopted hereditary surnames. The tax records from that year are one of the earliest comprehensive lists of fixed English family names, and they exist precisely because the government needed to know who had paid and who hadn't. The process created the naming categories you still see today. If your surname is Smith, Baker, Cooper, or Taylor, an ancestor was identified by their trade. If it's Hill, Wood, Brook, or Church, someone in your line was tagged by where they lived. If it's Johnson, Jackson, Williamson, or Richardson, the name began as a phrase, John's son, that compressed into a single word and then froze in place. If your name is Brown, Short, Armstrong, or Goodman, a physical trait or personality was observed once, and it stuck forever. None of these names were chosen in the way you'd choose a name today. They were assigned by context. By neighbors, by clerks, by tax collectors who needed a way to tell one William from another. Once the state's records adopted them, they became permanent. The name stopped being a description and became an identity. The label outlived the reason it was created. Notice the pattern. Surnames didn't become permanent because families decided they liked them. They became permanent because the state needed them to stay permanent. A fluid name is useless for tracking property across generations, collecting taxes from specific lineages, or conscripting soldiers from particular households. The fixed surname is a filing system, and you are the file. The Emperor's decree England's experience unfolded gradually, centuries of slow adoption driven by administrative pressure. Other places were not given the luxury of time. In 1787, Emperor Joseph II of the Habsburg Empire signed a decree that would reshape the identity of an entire population overnight. The decree ordered all Jews within the empire to adopt fixed, hereditary, German-language surnames. Before this date, most Ashkenazi Jews in Eastern Europe had no surnames at all. They used patronymics, David son of Abraham, Sarah daughter of Isaac, just as their ancestors had for centuries. The system worked within Jewish communities. It did not work for the Habsburg state, which needed to tax them, conscript them, and register their property. The decree was not optional. Habsburg officials were dispatched to villages and towns across the empire to register Jewish families and record their new names. The process was bureaucratic and impersonal. A clerk sat at a table, and families filed past to receive or select a surname that would follow their descendants forever. A widely repeated story claims that families who could afford to pay bribes received beautiful-sounding names. Goldberg, meaning Gold Mountain, Rosenthal, meaning Rose Valley, Silberstein, meaning Silver Stone, while those who couldn't pay were assigned humiliating or absurd names. The tale has a compelling symmetry. Wealth bought beauty, poverty earned mockery. Historian Alexander Bider has argued that this bribe narrative is largely folklore, unsupported by any surviving documentation. No price lists exist, no receipts, no official records of payment. What the evidence does show is something less dramatic, but in some ways more unsettling. Austrian clerks systematically invented compound surnames on an industrial scale, combining roots like gold, rosen, and silber with suffixes like berg, stein, and thal, and assigned them across communities in patterns that had nothing to do with the families themselves. The names were manufactured, mass-produced, bureaucratic poetry written by civil servants who needed to fill ledgers. What emerged was striking. Jews across Galicia, Bohemia, and other Habsburg territories suddenly carried German names, names manufactured by bureaucrats, names that bore no relationship to Jewish tradition, language, or self-understanding. For decades afterward, many Jewish families ignored their official surnames entirely. They continued using traditional patronymics in daily life, in religious documents, and on tombstones. The government name lived on paper. The real name lived in... But paper is what the state sees, and paper is what endured. Today, millions of people around the world carry surnames that were invented by an 18th century Habsburg clerk for the purpose of making Jewish communities legible to a tax-collecting empire. The names survived. The empire didn't. Napoleon extended the same project with characteristic bluntness. On July 20th, 1808, he issued a decree requiring all Jews in France and its territories to adopt fixed first and last names. The restrictions were deliberate. They could not choose place names, and Hebrew names not already in common French use were rejected. The decree established consistoires, Jewish regulatory bodies, to oversee the process. The intention was simultaneously assimilationist and administrative. Napoleon wanted Jews absorbed into the state's bureaucratic apparatus. A community that names itself on its own terms, using its own language and its own generational logic, is a community that can slip through your records. A community with state-registered surnames is one you can count, tax, conscript, and monitor for generations. What makes these episodes so revealing is not their cruelty, though cruelty was certainly present, it's their consistency. Every state in every era that reached a certain level of administrative ambition arrived at the same conclusion independently. We need surnames. We need fixed, hereditary, standardized names attached to every person, every family, every household. The specific mechanism varied. Organic evolution in England, imperial decree in the Habsburg Empire, Napoleonic fiat in France, but the underlying need was identical. The state cannot see you without a name, and a state that cannot see you cannot tax you. The catalogue of names. The most dramatic forced naming in modern history happened not in Europe, but in Southeast Asia. In November 1849, Governor-General Narciso Claveria, Izaldua of the Philippines, issued a decree that would erase the naming traditions of an entire archipelago. The stated reason was administrative chaos. Spanish colonial records couldn't reliably track Filipinos because naming practices varied wildly between regions. People used indigenous names, patronymics, geographic descriptions, or Spanish names adopted at baptism, and there was no standardization. The Treasury was losing revenue because it couldn't consistently identify who had paid taxes and who hadn't. Claveria's solution was breathtaking in its ambition and its violence. He commissioned the Catalogo Alphabetico de Apellidos, an alphabetical catalog of approved Spanish surnames, and distributed it to provincial governors across the islands. Each governor was assigned a section of the alphabet. Families in that province were required to select a surname from their governor's assigned letters. The consequence was absurd and permanent. Entire towns ended up with surnames starting with the same letter. In Miagao, Iloilo, residents still overwhelmingly carry surnames beginning with M, not because of shared ancestry, because a colonial administrator handed their great-grandparents a list and said, "Pick one from this page." The penalties for non-compliance were severe. Indigenous naming traditions, names drawn from landscape, ancestry, personal traits, were swept aside. A person who had been known as Cato Tabing Dagat, meaning beside the sea, was now Manuel Mendoza because the letter M was assigned to his province and Mendoza was on the list. The catalogue itself was hastily compiled and riddled with problems. It included words that weren't names at all. Utang, meaning debt, ended up as someone's surname. Teta, meaning nipple, became another. Families were saddled with labels that had no connection to their history, their language, or their identity. Some indigenous surnames survived the decree: Katigbak, Gatmaten, Lakandula, possibly because those families had existing criminal records, were already classified as civilized taxpayers, or simply refused. José Rizal's own mother, Teodora Alonso, was recorded under the imposed surname Realonda, a name the family neither chose nor wanted. Documented resistance from the Rizal family against colonial naming practices became part of the national hero's broader story of defiance against Spanish rule. The surname stuck anyway. Pause on what that means. Before November 1849, a Filipino person's name told a story. It said something real about where they came from, who their parents were, what their community valued. After November 1849, their name told a different story. Which letter of the alphabet a colonial governor had been assigned, and which page of a printed catalogue happened to be open when they walked into the registry office. The Claveria decree wasn't just a naming exercise. It was an act of administrative colonization on the most intimate possible level. It reached into the space where identity lives. Your name, the word people use when they think of you, and replaced whatever was there with something useful to the empire. The treasury needed standardized records. The church needed consistent baptismal registers. The military needed lists from which to conscript. And all of these needs converged on a single requirement. Every person must carry a fixed, hereditary, state-approved surname. What happened in the Philippines in 1849 stripped millions of people of their naming heritage in a single administrative act, and replaced it with a filing system designed to help a colonial treasury collect taxes more efficiently. The names that Filipino families carry today, names they've built identities around, names that feel as personal and rooted as any in the world. Many of them were pulled from an alphabetical catalogue by a Spanish bureaucrat who had never met them. The nations that named themselves. The pattern repeated in the 19th and 20th centuries as states modernized and demanded legibility from populations that had never needed surnames. In Japan, before the Meiji Restoration, surnames were a privilege reserved for the aristocratic and samurai classes. Commoners, farmers, merchants, artisans were known only by their given names. This wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate feature of the feudal system. Surnames marked social rank, and denying them to commoners reinforced the hierarchy. Then in 1875, the Meiji government issued the Family Registration Law, requiring every Japanese citizen to adopt a hereditary surname. The motivation was modernization. Japan was racing to match Western administrative systems, and a nation of people without last names couldn't be governed, taxed, or conscripted using Western bureaucratic methods. Millions of Japanese commoners suddenly needed a surname, and they needed one fast. The government wasn't going to wait for organic cultural evolution. It wanted census rolls and tax registers, and it wanted them now. Some commoners adopted the name of their local landlord, the feudal family they had served for generations. Others created names from the geographic features they saw every day. Yamamoto, base of the mountain. Tanaka, middle of the rice field. Watanabe, crossing the ferry. Suzuki, bell tree from Shinto harvest rituals. The names are beautiful. They're also mass-produced, because millions of people in the same regions looked out at the same mountains, the same rice paddies, the same rivers, and chose the same words. Japan ended up with an extraordinarily concentrated set of common surnames. Today, just 10 surnames account for roughly 10% of the entire Japanese population. The 5 most common: Sato, Suzuki, Takahashi, Tanaka, and Watanabe are shared by millions of people who have no familial connection to each other whatsoever. The naming wasn't organic. It was a mass administrative event compressed into a few years, driven by a government that needed its citizens to be countable. The patterns it created, the clustering, the repetition, the geographic fingerprints, are still visible a century and a half later, a permanent echo of a political decision made in 1875. Turkey followed a decade later, under even more dramatic circumstances. On June 21, 1934, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk signed the surname law requiring all Turkish citizens to adopt formal hereditary surnames for the first time. The Ottoman Empire had never required them. Turks used combinations of given names with titles, Hacha for pilgrims, Hoka for teachers, Ah for local notables, or geographic descriptors that shifted with context. In a single stroke of legislation, a nation of roughly 15 million people was told, "You have a year to pick a permanent last name, or one will be assigned to you." The law was part of Ataturk's sweeping modernization campaign. The same wave that replaced the Arabic alphabet with Latin letters, banned the fez, and secularized the legal system. Surnames were a statement. Turkey was no longer an empire of subjects. It was a republic of citizens, and citizens had to be identifiable, registrable, governable. The Grand National Assembly granted Ataturk himself the surname meaning Father of the Turks, and then passed a secondary law prohibiting anyone else from ever using it. Even his own sister was given a different surname. Citizens scrambled to choose surnames from a vocabulary that was entirely new to them. Some picked words reflecting physical traits: Pehlivan, meaning wrestler; Sakala, meaning bearded. Others chose character descriptors: Çalışkan, meaning hard-working; Güler, meaning one who smiles. Some referenced historical battles: Sakarya, after the 1921 victory that helped secure Turkish independence. The most common surnames that emerged, Yilmaz, Kaya, Demir, Yıldız, are simple, sturdy Turkish words meaning undaunted, rock, iron, star. An entire nation named itself in a matter of months. Registrar errors became permanent names. In at least one documented case, a clerk recorded Dundar instead of the intended Dindar, and the family has carried the mistake ever since. A bureaucratic typo, frozen in law, carried forward through generations. The name you pass to your children might be a registrar's spelling error from 1934, and there is no mechanism on earth to fix it because the error is older than anyone alive who might challenge it. The state sees you political scientist James C. Scott described the surname as one of the foundational tools of what he called state legibility, the process by which governments make their populations visible and manageable. Scott's argument, laid out in his book Seeing Like a State, is that pre-modern governments were essentially blind. They couldn't see their citizens. They didn't know how many people lived in a given territory, who owned which property, who owed taxes, or who was eligible for military service. The surname was one of the earliest technologies deployed to fix that blindness. Before permanent surnames, a man named William Robertson's son might be called Thomas Williamson. Thomas's son might be Peter Thomason. The name changed every generation. From the state's perspective, this made it nearly impossible to track inheritance, enforce debts, or collect taxes across generations. The fixed surname solved that problem. It pinned a family to a name, and that name could be followed through registers, census records, and tax rolls for centuries. Scott traced how this technology escalated over centuries, each layer building on the one before. The surname was the foundation, but it was only the first brick. States layered on parish registers in the 16th century, then civil birth and death certificates in the 19th. Property registers, identity cards, and passports followed. By the 20th century, the stack included social security numbers, photographs, fingerprints, and, in the 21st, DNA profiles and facial recognition data. Each layer added another dimension of visibility. Each one made you more legible to the state, and each one was introduced with the same justification. We need to know who you are for your own protection, for the common good, for the orderly functioning of society. Every one of these technologies followed the same pattern the surname established centuries ago. They were introduced for administrative convenience, taxation, conscription, property law, and then became so deeply embedded in daily life that people stopped seeing them as tools of control and started treating them as facts of nature. Your social security number feels like it belongs to you. Your passport feels like an expression of your identity. Your last name feels like your heritage. None of them were designed for you. They were designed for the system that needs to locate you within itself. The name you carry step back from the history and look at your own life. Every form you fill out asks for your surname first. Your bank knows you by it. Your employer files you under it. Your government taxes you through it. When you marry, one of the first legal questions is which surname the new household will carry, because the state needs the family unit to remain trackable. When a child is born, the surname isn't optional. It's required by law in virtually every country on Earth. You can't just be Sarah. You have to be Sarah something, because Sarah alone is invisible to the system. Your surname determines more than you think. When you apply for a job, a loan, a visa, or an apartment, your surname is often the first piece of information the decision-maker sees. Studies across multiple countries have shown that identical resumes with different surnames receive dramatically different callback rates. A name that signals a particular ethnicity or national origin can open doors or close them before a single qualification is read. The name that a Habsburg clerk manufactured, or a colonial administrator pulled from a catalogue, or a medieval tax collector scribbled into a ledger. That name, chosen arbitrarily for administrative convenience centuries ago, is still shaping your economic reality right now. It follows you into every interview, every credit application, every border crossing. It arrives before you do. And it's already made an impression before you've said a word. And the infrastructure that the surname enabled has only expanded. The surname was the first layer. The social security number was the second. The biometric profile is the third. Each generation of administrative technology makes you more visible, more trackable, more legible. The surname turned you from a face in a village into an entry in a register. The social security number turned you into a node in a financial network. The biometric profile is turning you into a data point that can be identified anywhere on Earth instantly, without your participation. All of it traces back to the same impulse that drove the Domesday Book in 1086, the Habsburg Decree in 1787, and the Claveria Catalogue in 1849. A state that needs to see you, count you, and take a share of what you produce. The method has evolved beyond anything William the Conqueror could have imagined. The purpose hasn't changed by a single degree. Your last name isn't a family tradition that stretches back into the mists of time. For most families on Earth, it's a few centuries old at most. In Japan, it's barely 150 years old. In Turkey, it's not even a century. In the Philippines, it was pulled from a printed list by a colonial official who needed to balance his books. You carry it with pride. You pass it to your children. You search its origins on genealogy websites and feel a swell of connection to ancestors you never met. You feel it in your bones as something fundamental to who you are, as natural as your face, as permanent as your fingerprints, and it was assigned to you, or to someone in your line, not very long ago, by a government that didn't care who you were. It cared that it could find you. Closing, there's one place left on Earth where this system never took hold. In Iceland, people still don't use hereditary surnames. A man named John, whose father was Einar, is John Einarsson. His daughter Gudrun is Gudrun Jonsdottir. The name changes every generation, just as names changed everywhere else before the state got involved. There is no family name that passes from parent to child to grandchild. Icelanders are listed in the phone book by first name. They address their president by first name. Strangers call each other by first name in professional settings, in banks, in hospitals. The system works because Iceland is small enough, roughly 400,000 people, that the old way still holds. The government has adapted its bureaucracy to function without hereditary surnames, rather than forcing a population to adopt them. It's the lone exception. A living fossil of the world before the surname, surviving into the modern era because one island happened to stay small enough that the state never needed to reach for that particular tool. Everyone else on Earth carries a label that was invented by a government, for a government, to solve a government's problem. Somewhere in your family's past, maybe 4 centuries ago, maybe 2, maybe less than 1, an ancestor stood in front of an official who needed a word to write in a ledger. Whatever that official wrote down, for reasons that had nothing to do with your family story, became your story. You've carried it your whole life. You've built your identity around it. Yet you never once asked where it came from. Now you know. If this changed the way you think about the identity you inherited, subscribe. We trace the hidden origins of the rules you live by and show you who wrote them.